Well, welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar, Getting Soil and Nutrition Management Right with the EnviroVeg program. My name's Carl Larson from RMCG, part of the Soil Wealth and Integrated Crop Protection Extension teams based in Melbourne, and a good morning to you if you're over in the West, as one of our presenters, David Anderson, is this morning, or if you're joining from elsewhere. So, today, we've got three presenters for you. First up is Andrew Shaw from AUSVEG, who's going to be talking to us about the new EnviroVeg program. And secondly, we've got David Anderson from Supafresh over in Western Australia talking to us about the main benefits from being involved in the program and how that fits with David's business and what he's found in the past. And we'll finish up too with a bit of a technical presentation from Doris Blaesing from RMCG, my colleague down in Tasmania today. So we're joining all parts of the country together, and she'll be talking to us about effective nitrogen use for vegetables. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. If you've joined one of these webinars before or it's your first one, we'll just quickly talk through what you can see on your screen. In the control panel, which should be on your sidebar. You can see other attendees, and we've got over 100 people registered for today, so you can have a bit of a sticky beak to see who's on the line, if you know them, if you don't know them, and your audio controls in terms of video and audio. I've just got everyone muted at the moment just so we limit background noise. You'll also see a question breakout window there where at any time during the webinar, if you've got a question on some of the content, type it into that and it'll come straight through to me and I can ask either one of the presenters or all the presenters as a panel as we go through. We want to make sure it's a bit interactive and not just one way, so feel free to raise your hand or type a question in as we go along. You'll also notice in the control panel a handout bar. Now there's 5 handouts there. We've got a couple related to EnviroVeg around an overview of the program and applying for the pilot program, but I'll let Andy have a bit more of an in-depth talk about that shortly. There's also a couple of fact sheets around a quick guide to farm nitrogen and making the most of your nitrogen on farm, which was recently released. It's a great little resource. And the 5th resource there is just a fertiliser decision fact sheet put together by Doris, which includes a really neat nitrogen balance template at the back there, which might be a nice takeaway after we hear some of the presentations today. So before we get started, it's always good to understand where everyone's up to on the line. You'll notice up on your screen now, I've just launched a quick poll. How much experience do you have in soil and nutrition management in vegetables? If you wouldn't mind just quickly choosing one of the 4 options there, lots, a bit, not much, none but keen to know more. That just gives each of us an idea as to where everyone's up to, and we can share the results back with you. So, who we've got on the line? We've got over half of us with a bit of knowledge, and a quarter with a lot, and a few down the not much and none area. So, a bit of a spread, that just helps us pitch some of the content as well. Excellent. So, to get us started, I'll pass now over to Andrew Shaw. Andy, I'll just share your screen just a moment. And over to you.
Thanks, Carl. Is that all right? Everyone can see that?
Yep, we can see your slides, Andy, so over to you.
All right, so yeah, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Andy Shaw. I coordinate the EnviroVeg program here at AUSVEG. So EnviroVeg, what is it? It's an environmental vegetable production program aiming at uptaking best management practices on farm, on vegetable farms, and it does that through a range of resources from self-assessment through to certification and everything in between. So we've got a new project for EnviroVeg, which I'll take you through how that's structured, as well as a new program structure to come with the new project. And then I'll tell you about the EnviroVeg pilot program and some things that are happening there and how you can be involved within the EnviroVeg program. So EnviroVeg, the new project, has 3 project partners: AUSVEG, GrowCom and FreshCare, all on board, and it's about building on the previous vegetable levy funded R&D projects and this new R&D vegetable levy funded project to develop a collaborative and effective structure. So we've got strong R&D connections. So at the moment we have a technical advisory committee working on the update of project resources, assessment materials, best practice guidelines, those sorts of things. That's about valuable data, so growers and program members being able to benchmark against other growers, and about providing information back to the industry about where investments in R&D should go. It's about recognition for program members. So you may notice we've got a new logo. The frog's hopped off. It's all about how can we get recognition for the best practice environmental procedures that are being implemented on vegetable farms throughout Australia. And of course it's about environmental management on farm, so uptake of good R&D in those areas. So how do these 3 project partners tie in together, and why is the project as it is? So you sort of have 3 programs harmonising as one in this new EnviroVeg project. You have EnviroVeg, Hort 360 and FreshCare Environmental. So certification requirements through the EnviroVeg program are now aligned with FreshCare Environmental, and the Hort 360 program provides a platform to gather that benchmarking data and the self-assessment process on there. It's all about better growing, recognition and that good data through the EnviroVeg program. Within the structure of the new program, you have industry representation, so it's grower-owned led. There's a steering committee of see the made about how to move the program forward. There's connections to growers all over the country, and that's sort of how this new project came about, was feedback from growers itself. So it's grower-owned and grower-led. You have good quality R&D involved, so the technical committee, the EnviroVeg resource, so the updated best practice guidelines, make sure we have good R&D underpinning everything that happens through the EnviroVeg program. And that allows you to work on best practice improvement. So uptake of this R&D on farm, you do your self-assessment, identify those gaps, and work to improve cost and production savings on farm through all the connected resources. I'll take you through the resources in a second. And of course the best practice improvement allows you to move through certification, so the pathway to FreshCare Environmental certification. And once you achieve that, you can access marketing and representation through the program. And because it's a recognised third-party assurance program, that allows us to underpin everything we do and legitimise the process, as does the harmonised structure. So it's about getting all those industry resources in one useful program and making sure that they're all available and accessible to everyone involved. So that's how the harmonised structure ties in. Within the program, what resources do you have? So there's the EnviroVeg resource, which is the best practice guidelines, and that's a collation of all the R&D in the different areas. So soil health on farm is one of those areas, and you will be able to go through your self-assessment, identify areas you'd like improvement on, and the self-assessment will spit out a feedback report linked to the resource, so that you can see what areas you'd like to improve in, and also give you the good up-to-date R&D in those areas. There's facilitated training, so if you want further one-on-one support in those specific areas, you can access that based on these resources. There's the website, which will collate all of this information into one, and then there's the resources and support through the program. If you want more information on EnviroVeg and this new structure, yeah, there's a handout that you can download through the webinar here. At the end of the program, what do you get? What are the benefits of being a member of EnviroVeg? There's access to branding. There's your tracking and benchmarking of the good processes you have and being able to prove those practices to your supply chain and your community. There's the guidance and improvement that you get from going through the program and identifying those cost savings to have a healthy farm with good production benefits. So that's the program as it will sit moving forward. The new program, all those resources that will be in place. So, for example, if you move with the soil section specifically, you do your self-assessment, understand your inputs there, and get the feedback report that could identify good R&D in those spaces that you can do through the EnviroVeg resource. And then you can move through the facilitated training and onto certification, because the certification is within all the resources of the program contain information on how to move through to certification if that's the path you want to take as well. So what's happening right now within the program? The new project started in March this year, and it's 5 years long. So all these things I'm talking about are being developed currently. We're consolidating the structure between those three programs: Fresh Care Environmental, Core 360, and EnviroVeg, tying them all together and updating the resources such as the assessment materials and the manual, so that it all logically connects and is related to good R&D. And then there's how to develop program recognition, so recognition for good environmental practices, something else I'm working on. And a major part of the next year moving forward will be the pilot program. So the pilot program is funding for 30 businesses, vegetable growing businesses, to move through to the certified level of the EnviroVeg program, so certification to Fresh Care Environmental. And it's sort of a good example of using all of the resources within the program to progress all the way through and identify those cost savings and reach certification. So I'll just take you through the three main sections within the pilot program. Applications are now open, and that's also another handout link that's got more information on how the pilot program is structured and how to apply for that. So the first part is the gap analysis, so using the self-assessment to identify those areas for improvement, and you can self-identify where you'd like further training and what you need to do to implement certification. And that takes around an hour or less, depending on the information you have available. And then you move on to the facilitated training. So a best management practice expert comes out and gives you individual support based on those gaps you've identified previously within the previous section of the pilot program. And it also gets you ready for certification. So meets the training requirements for Fresh Care Environmental and allows you to get one-on-one support to make sure you're happy to move through to the audit, as well as implement those production and cost savings that you've identified previously. And that one-on-one training takes place over a day. And then you can move through to certification. So going through an audit obviously takes around a day, and certification to Fresh Care Environmental, you get the support through the process and access to the branding and recognition within the program once you move to that certified level. So those are that's the structure of the pilot program. What do you get at the end of it? You get recognition, so you can talk to those within your supply chain and in your local communities about what you're doing through the EnviroVeg program. You get access to the branding and the associated benefits for recognition and certification to a recognised environmental standard, Fresh Care Environmental. You get the resources, so training, ongoing support from personnel. You get the plan to implement these R&D and achieve sustainable farming practices and access to the latest R&D through the program. and you identify savings. So yeah, savings in production management, cost savings, and of course the cost covered from moving through the pilot program. So that's the pilot program in a nutshell. And yeah, for more information, have a look at the handout there. We rolled out over 2018, so applications now open, closing early next year, in February, I think, and well, there'll be a formal selection process with members of Hort Innovation and the program, and there are the distribution of applicants available is based on how many vegetable producers are in each state and those sorts of things. So happy to talk more about that if you've got any questions. But what's next with the program with EnviroVeg? So right now we're developing those structures, updating those resources, getting this program out up and running, and engaging with the previous members of the program to get it all rolling. And then what I need to focus on from my point of view is to get this project some recognition for its members, making sure people are on board, making sure the growers involved and the vegetable producers out there find it beneficial, so we incorporate that feedback back into the program, continue to make sure that vegetable growers find this program supportive and useful, because without that, what's the point? So that's what's happening with EnviroVeg and what's next with the program. What can you do? You can get involved, you can apply for the pilot program, you can look out for all these resources to come out early next year in 2018. You can use those, you can give me feedback, you can get in touch with me to further discuss the project and the program and how it's all working and what we can do together. So that's a short summary of EnviroVeg and what's happening there. So thanks for listening and thanks for tuning in today, and I'm happy to take any questions, Carl, if you're happy with that.
Great, thanks, Andy. We've got a question from Donna. What are the eligibility requirements for the pilot program?
Sure. So we're trying to encourage new members to get involved in the program. So everyone's able to apply. You'll be looked upon favourably if you haven't been to the certified level before. Then we can help you through to that. There's also support for the currently certified members to help transition across to this new version of the program. And we're looking for people that want to champion their environmental credentials, so we can get the word out about this program. So there are questions in the application form about that, about your willingness to talk about the project and the program and what you're doing. But it's open to all. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. And we've got another question through from Andy Gulliver over in WA. Is the program for individual vegetable growers only, or can groups join, or suppliers?
Yes, groups and suppliers can join, but it's targeted, because it's a vegetable levy funded program. It's targeted at the vegetable levy payers and growers. But there are resources to help encompass larger organisations as well. So that's certainly encouraged as well.
Yeah, great, excellent. Thanks for those questions, Andy, and hopefully Adam, that answered your question as well, because it was along similar lines. Another question in, Andy, are potato growers eligible as well, just given the mix of levy funding projects?
Yeah, I encourage all vegetable growers to get involved, even though it's funded through the vegetable levy itself and not the potato levy. The resources and things that come through with the EnviroVeg program are definitely applicable to potato growers as well. So I'd encourage them to get involved. Yeah.
Great. Andy, you mentioned earlier the resources that are under development at the moment, and part of today's webinar was designed to link with the soils module of that. What else are the resources covering for those that aren't aware or haven't been involved in EnviroVeg before?
Sure. So there's sort of around 10 different modules from water, all the different resource management areas, and then a business management overall structure as well. So there's soils and water and energy and air and biosecurity and biodiversity, and there's probably one or two that I'm forgetting. So there's all those different resources you have on a farm and how to manage those and in a sustainable way, and how to incorporate best management practices into those different areas. Yeah.
And when they're finalised in 2018, where and how can people get access to those?
Yep, so they'll be freely available on the updated EnviroVeg website. So we'll put it up there so you can download each section if you want, or everything as a whole, or you can just look at it online. So that'll be the easiest way to get at it. And the self-assessment as well will be freely accessible, so that you can do all these things and link it all together. Yeah, so the website, easiest way to find it when it's ready.
Great. And Doris, I might throw it over to you to get involved. Did you have any questions or comments for Andy before we move on?
Yeah, Andy, probably one thing that might not be clear to everybody is whether everybody has to go through certification, or can you be a member and just benefit from the information rather than having to go through the certification assessment?
Sure, yeah. You can stick to whatever part of the program you want to be involved in. So if you just want to be able to do the self-assessment level, that's fine, and that'll definitely help you as well. But it's designed to be able to help those that want to move to certification. Yeah, so you can stick to the self-assessment level, and the facilitated training is there if you need it, if you want it, and that's sort of the structure. So that all the resources are there for anyone that wants to use them, and we can help drive uptake that way. But yeah, you can just stay at the self-assessment level as long as you do it annually and stay involved. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that, Andrew. We might move on, and thanks also to everyone for those questions. Keep them coming in as we move along. I'm going to hand over to David now, and he's going to take us through why get involved in EnviroVeg and what some of the main benefits he's seen in being involved as well. So, David, over to you.
Thanks, Carl, and hi all, and thanks for joining the webinar. I've been part of the EnviroVeg program over many years through the levy funding organisations of HRDC, HAL and now HIA. The program started with a self-assessment guide to get the regulators off our back and the industry talking and acting on environmental assurance. This has made the tiers of local and state government aware that the vegetable industry was responsible. With the normal evolution of time and increased pressure on growers, this has now moved into a more substantial phase of the program where it is fully preparing industry for a third-party auditable environmental assurance should the growers want to go down this path. The program's benefits is that it is a vegetable-ready system. In the past, I was able to use the records we had kept for food safety and the EnviroVeg program to make a point to our local council in Western Australia that we, as vegetable growers, actually cared for our water and land and here, and it is documented and evidence to prove it. For our customers too, which were mainly export, they all asked the question, are you good custodians of the land? As a family company, we were able to explain soil biology, water use, and why and how we were using chemicals. This was all clearly laid out in the self-assessment guide with clear headings. Now working for a bigger family business in a new vegetable production area, EnviroVeg has given our employees and local government awareness of the efforts the farmers put in to be good custodians of the natural resources they have. Obviously, the land, water and chemical use comes under scrutiny, but efforts in air quality and biodiversity show commitment to the environment. Water scheduling and the technology around this is critical in making every megalitre count. The use of technology in measuring and monitoring water equipment and irrigation systems has taken the industry a long way, but you still can't beat looking at a crop and digging in the soil every day to tell you where you're at. With our former family business, we were clearly using some old chemistry with our old chemicals, and we're having difficulties managing the soil health. On our place, every piece of dirt was being cropped 2.5 times per year. The manual gave us real clarity about soil health and how we were able to change the culture inside the business to be more environmentally friendly. Integrated pest management hadn't really evolved then, but now IPM has certainly been a major part of growing on the Swan Coastal Plain near Perth. This in turn led to smaller chemical bills, less problems from pests and diseases. This has now taken on a life of its own to the latest R&D technology being included in the program. Now, with increased regulation and more red tape, the program is a must for the industry to set itself up for the next 20 to 50 years of vegetable production. Yes, technology will change, but the basics of planting a seed and hopefully turning that seed into a healthy and profitable crop won't. Our day-to-day operations now in the Supafresh business, which is across carrots, potatoes and baby leaf, hasn't really changed a lot. But what it's done is it's made us more aware of the things that we do each day that have less of a footprint on the environment. The major retailers are looking at what's available in this space now. The industry needs to be prepared and comfortable for the changes that are coming. I can only reiterate in Andy's talk about the pilot program, and I would encourage people to get on board with that. And don't forget, EnviroVeg is our levy money at work. Thanks, Carl.
Excellent. Thanks, David. A really good insight as to where you've come from at a business level, but also involvement with the program. I'd encourage people on the line, if they've got any questions for David, to type those in now. And while we're waiting for them, David, a quick one from me. Some of those main needs early on when you switched, you mentioned things like IPM. What were some of those areas of support that you needed to, I guess, take that first step?
With the IPM, we really needed a leap of faith to change from what we'd been doing, you know, over 3 generations in my case, and introduce things like predatory wasp that ate the Heliothis grub eggs in the top of the corn that we were growing. So somebody came along with an idea that, you know, this predatory wasp would actually take out the problem, because Heliothis in sweet corn is a major problem in the tassels. So yeah, we tried it, and you know, we hummed and hawed for 3 or 4 plantings, but then all of a sudden the predatory wasps built up enough, and they were able to cut our chemical bill to about 15% of what it had been 3 months ago. So it's those integration, it's those information and the quantum leap of faith you need for integrated pest management that actually proves that the science actually works. You don't have to reach for a chemical bottle, and that in turn, you know, leads to a less of an environmental footprint for all of us.
No, that's great. And just specifically relating back to soils and nutrition management, which is the theme of today, David, you mentioned, you know, nothing beats getting out and digging a bit of a soil pit and seeing it firsthand. What are some of the main changes that you've made around soil management and soil health under the program?
So with the soil health, with the business, the family business that I'm currently working in, with the soil health, we came across a very light sand, where we refer to it as a basandine soil. And for the crops that we were growing, it didn't really retain the moisture or the fertiliser that we wanted it to. So we introduced sorghum over the summer and grew it up to about shoulder height. And then instead of harvesting the sorghum and using it for stock feed, we actually trashed the whole lot into the ground. And within 2 years, we can see a remarkable difference in the soil health of not having to reach for a smaller, more often amount of fertiliser, but also the moisture retention with the fertiliser and the water going past the root zone has really helped enormously. So you look at things in a business as a cost, but it actually generates cost savings inside the business within the 2 years that we'd been on the property.
That's fantastic. Thanks, David. We've got another question that's come in. How important is EnviroVeg for accessing markets?
At the moment, it's not overly important, but with the resource that's being built and the technical knowledge that's coming into the EnviroVeg program, we can see that customer requirements are going to be going down this line. Some customers, yes, they do want environmental assurance, and that's their prerogative to do that. But generally, the momentum for it is starting to build. So where the food safety came in, 15 or 20 years ago, it was a relatively simple program. But then the question started coming about, how rigorous was the food safety program? So then it became onerous, and there was many food safety programs, and we've led to the last 5 years a real complexity. The good thing about EnviroVeg is it's a vegetable ready, recognised across the board program that gives it. So the customers across the central markets and all of the major retailers aren't insisting on it, but the times are changing, and we have to be ready for that. And this is the investment in our levy that we're starting to get. We're starting to see the benefit. It's a vegetable ready program.
Fantastic. And Andy, I might hand over to you and just cross-check, is David's experience similar to others that you hear around the country, or are there other different benefits from the grower perspective that you come across?
Yeah, I find that a number of growers find the program useful in terms of their local communities as well, so local council groups, about informing what they're doing is positive for the environment and maintaining the resources that growers look after. So that's a major plus from being involved, I find. And it's also, we're trying to figure out the best way to incorporate the program within other markets such as export and those sorts of things. So there's a number of different avenues being pursued within the program to develop those recognition benefits. But the main one is the cost production, so saving those resources on farm and saving money. So that's the simplest and most common benefit from being involved.
Great. And Doris, one thing that Andy mentioned earlier was around technical resources, and David mentioned the importance of that technical support, having the resource to refer to. What are some of the main things that have changed over the last, say, 2 or 3 years around soil and nutrition management?
I think a lot of knowledge has changed or improved. So we now can incorporate things like precision ag technologies, like use of composts, and more information on cover crops. So all the new research coming through different programs from the vegetable industry, the same the weeds program, the soil waste program. So EnviroVeg can actually use all the new knowledge, which is fantastic. And it can be updated as new requests or new research comes to light. We also can have another look at climate variability. So the idea is to keep the program really flexible and up to date. So, you know, keep it live. That's really important.
No, excellent. Yeah. And that's probably a nice segue, actually. So, David, thanks for your presentation and for those questions too. We might hand over now to Doris, who's going to take us through making the most of nitrogen. Doris, I'll just share your screen and I'll hand over to you.
Okay, we mentioned nitrogen, actually a couple of things talking about the supply chain and markets. As you might know, I'm from Germany, and there nitrogen has been regulated for nearly 30 years. And you might also know that a lot of the supermarket head honchos are actually from Europe, either from the UK or from Germany. And there has been some whispering about, you know, asking growers to better monitor nitrogen in vegetable crops. So it's quite topical because of that. It's also topical because nitrogen and community concerns in Werribee were actually the start of EnviroVeg. So it was grower driven right from the start, and it was driven to prove to the local community that they look after the streams and the environment. So nitrogen was driver of that. So and I thought I can't start talking about nitrogen without showing you the nitrogen cycle, because everybody does that. And I'm very surprised that poor Bambi is involved in that as well. So if you want to know more about nitrogen cycles, you can go to the internet and find lots of beautiful pictures. But I just thought we might today stick with the facts. So you see on this slide what we're going to talk about. I tried to stick to 7 points, but I ended up with 8. And we get my friend Nitrous Nelly to lead us through the talk. I don't want to read all this to you because that will be the headings I will be using. So obviously, we're getting a lot of questions about nitrogen fertilizers. And I picked out 3 which are the main nitrogen sources: urea, ammonium-based fertilizers, and nitrate. And they behave quite differently in the soil, in the environment, and for your crop. And I don't want to go through all that information because we actually have a fact sheet on it. So I picked out a few important or environmentally important points. Urea is actually highly soluble and can move with water. That's, for instance, the only nitrogen source you can use in furrow irrigation, which hopefully is a thing of the past very soon. Ammonium is interesting because it actually doesn't wash out easily, but unfortunately it does compete with calcium, potassium, and magnesium because it is a cation. So it's got a positive charge just like these other elements. With nitrate, which is really readily taken up, but it's really soluble in salt water and it's easily lost. So there are good and bad things about each of these fertilizers, and the choice is all yours. You just have to remind yourself what you're getting. For instance, with nitrate, you get an immediate hit. Urea, for urea, you need a bit of warmth and microbes to actually make it work, and you can easily lose it to fresh air or in the water table. So just, you know, when you make a choice, be aware of what the different products are doing. Another aspect that often fascinated me, and I know that in the grains industry that's something that has to be done because they can't irrigate. Most of grain growers don't irrigate. However, in vegetables, we can irrigate, we can time fertilizer applications, we can fertigate. There are a lot of options, and still a lot of growers seem to put the biggest amount of nitrogen up front in the soil and then hope for the best. So by the time you have the rapid growth phase, the nitrogen put on at the beginning is actually not all there anymore, and we don't actually know how much we have lost. So it's probably worthwhile thinking a bit more about the growth curves and when the nitrogen is needed. It certainly is not needed right at the beginning when you seed or plant. So it might be something to review with agronomists to actually when to apply nitrogen. And it's different for every vegetable crop, so I don't want to go into more detail. I just wanted to show you the fert care rules, get the right source at the right rate, the right place, and at the right time. So that's a good one to remember. One of my hobby horses is that I don't like fertilizer recipes and I hate nitrogen trials, because every trial result, if you try 50, 100, 150 K and compare that, well, the results will be right for that crop in that year on that farm, but it will not be right on other farms or in other years. So it is quite useless to me anyway. It doesn't make sense. However, it makes sense to understand how much a different or each vegetable crop actually will remove from the soil. So there's quite good information available on how much nitrogen is removed in kilograms per ton. And you can actually measure that yourself if you wanted to. The yield, I mean, I made that up. I'm sure there will be some growers will think, well, that's pretty funny yield. But anyway, that can be changed quite easily. But you can quickly see how different the nitrogen removal per hectare is. You have, for instance, spinach, which is quite a high uptake, but because of the relatively low yield, the removal is quite low, and you go down to sweet corn, and the removal is huge. The uptake is actually not very high. Or the removal is very high, but others, like a cucumber, doesn't remove much. So just be aware that this information is available and can help you to indicate what you actually need. And as you know, if you have too much nitrogen, you get soft growth. In lettuce, you get tip burn. And it seems that a lot of pests and diseases recognize oversupplied or over-fertilized vegetables and like to feed on them. Another thing you know is nitrogen can acidify soils. The reason why I mention it here, I often get the argument that a certain fertilizer is cheaper or is cheap. For instance, calcium nitrate and potassium nitrate have nearly no effect or no effect on the pH, whereas urea, DAP, and MAP and sulfate ammonia do. So when you do your budget, your financial budget, and you look at the cost of a fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizers, you have to add to it the cost of the lime. And maybe some negative effect these elements can have on your crops. Again, I don't say you shouldn't use any of these fertilizers, but use them wisely and be aware that you have to watch the pH. Again, a lot of growers now use cover crops, use compost and other soil health management practices, which is great. However, they forget that with that kind of inputs, they actually increase organic matter and they increase the nitrogen level in the soil and nitrogen cycling. So using the old approach on the old recipes to grow under these conditions can be really wrong and can lead to actually worse quality. So then people would say, oh, this compost didn't work or this cover crop didn't work. The problem is maybe that the fertilizer program didn't work anymore because a new variable has been introduced, and that's why it's really important to monitor nutrition to actually manage it properly. So if you have more soil organisms and microorganisms working in your soil, you will reduce the fertilizer bill, but you have to actually find out on your farm and in your crop how these systems work. There are now recipes that will actually work. You can see on average 5 to 25% of total organic N can be mineralized each year. That can be higher than 25 and can be lower than 5 depending on the irrigation system and where you are on your soils and conditions. So there is really now a recipe. Once you start looking after your soil, there's a lot of monitoring and actually learning. Like David said, kicking the dirt is a good idea. One thing we often forget, if we do increase organic matter, we do increase nitrogen. I just said there is a certain percentage of nitrogen in organic matter. Of that, probably 98% is actually a total N, which is bound in the organic matter and is only free when that organic matter is broken down. And I really like this graph from Bill Koching, where you can see that pastures definitely help you to increase nitrogen levels. We're growing vegetables here, but the reduction of tillage will preserve organic matter and residue retention, so not getting rid of or removing crop residues, but working them in. Some people have started to actually use their packing jet waste and macerate it and put it back on the paddock. So there are a lot of ways of actually getting our carbon kit here working and making sure we actually also increase nitrogen in the soil. Again, this nitrogen is a resource that reduces fertilizer needs. Some more free nitrogen from microbes, either with legumes, and I put some numbers there. People often ask how much on average will be fixed by the different crops, by the different legume crops, and there's some indication you can look up. And then we have the Azotobacter, which are free-living microbes, and there's actually quite a lot more, but I thought I use Azotobacter as the main one. It's fixing nitrogen, but it actually has additional benefits in the soil and rhizosphere in interaction with roots, even though it is not living inside the roots. Unfortunately, and I did quite a few measurements with microbiology, is that as soon as you add a lot of nitrogen to a soil which is actually in good condition, Azotobacter gets a bit miffed and disappears, but it bounces back. So it's not, I mean, that's a good thing about microbes. Unless you do really nasty stuff, they're actually quite resilient and they do bounce back. The main nitrogen losses from the root zone is obviously leaching, and it's either having too much nitrogen put on in one hit, having unseasonal rain, and there's nothing you can do about rain, but a lot of people actually do over-irrigate because they like to see the soil wet and have a fear of under-irrigation. Irrigation is a real challenge in, for instance, the baby leaf, like David mentioned, because it's got a very shallow root system, so you have to irrigate constantly with a little bit, and if you wash the nitrogen just below the root zone, which is not deep, you've already lost it. So I like David talking about using a cover crop, because this cover crop, if it roots deeply, it will capture the nitrogen and bring it back into the system. So it's really important, especially in the sand, the nitrogen will just go through to the groundwater and into the sea, which is probably not what we want. Of course, when the soil is really wet, we can lose nitrogen through denitrification. So if you study your nitrogen cycle, it will talk about denitrification. The main thing is to remember that nitrate to wet soils is a no-no, because you will lose the nitrogen. So your money is going to go into thin air. The same can happen with ammonium or ammonia from urea. So you really have to be careful and understand the different conditions that makes nitrogen go to thin air. FertCare has actually a very good resource, like a booklet, on the FertCare website about nitrogen losses, and we actually have a fact sheet. I don't know whether it's in the handouts, but the Soil Wealth website also has a brief fact sheet on nitrogen losses. Another issue is, of course, surface runoff. If there's erosion and compaction, compacted soil, I think, is really difficult to manage, not only because roots don't like to go into it. Usually there's little organic matter, but keeping the soil moisture right in a compacted soil is really difficult. It's wet and waterlogged really quickly, and it's dry really quickly. So managing nutrition and everything in a compacted soil is a minor nightmare. Burning of crop residues, I think that's not done much anymore, but I thought I'd just mention it. This is an interesting one. I put this in. This is actually an example from potato crops, in old simpler processing potato crops. It doesn't matter though, I just used it because it's a good picture. You can see on the bottom axis, the horizontal axis, the nitrogen fertilizer inputs, and you see the yields on the vertical axis. The interesting thing is that you know, there's a lot of nitrogen put on without actually getting any yield benefit, and you can see there's no correlation between nitrogen inputs on yield. And if you do that, I've done it with bean crops and with pea crops and lettuce crops, and you can just keep going. There is no correlation between nitrogen inputs and yield. There is, of course, if you do a fertilizer trial, like I mentioned before, but if you look at commercial crops, it doesn't hold, because there are so many different things that influence how the nitrogen works and what else influences yield. So to think that by using higher rates of nitrogen you necessarily get a higher yield is not right. You might necessarily spend a lot more money and lose a lot of nitrogen into air and the water. So it is really worthwhile looking at what we did, the nitrogen use efficiency, and you could see that in the crops, the lowest was 57%, and the highest was more than 100%. More than 100% sounds funny. However, there were potatoes grown after a legume crop, so it was actually a bit of mining of nitrogen involved in that case. And 57 is some of the crops where people really overdo the nitrogen. So the more you put on, the less benefit you have. So that's a bit of food for thought.
Doris, we've just got a question come in from Adam Chapman. He's just asked, at what carbon to nitrogen ratio does net immobilisation of nitrogen occur?
If you have carbon to nitrogen too high, similar to the, it works the same as carbon mineralization. So it's the kind of rule of having something around 10 to 20 C to N. You get good mineralization, whereas if the carbon is higher and the nitrogen is lower, you will have less because the organic matter isn't broken down.
Mm.
So you need the breakdown of organic matter to actually get the nitrogen cycling.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question, Adam. Thanks, Doris.
Yeah, that's happy to take them in between. I just here's something else I prepared earlier. Just in one spring, measuring soil nitrate in a range of paddocks. These were all actually destined for poppy production. Again, it doesn't really matter which crop you put on. What matters is that you can see, there is nitrate in the soil prior to seeding of several hundred kilograms per hectare, and there is other paddocks which have nearly nothing. So you see that, and now that the poppy industry's got wonderful recipes for when and how much to fertilize, and they all do the same. And people say, oh, this is a bad year for poppies because my paddock is turning yellow really easily. And I said, well, it's turning yellow because you started off with nothing. Yes, others have problems with not getting high alkaloids or layering and bad quality and disease because they start putting the recipe on paddocks with really high nitrogen. So we have the tools to actually measure these things. It'd be nice to use them to get it right. So this is the pre-planting idea to actually measure, and this actually by law in Europe and Britain, there's a law saying you have to do this. Or it might not be in Britain, but definitely in Holland and Germany, you have to measure nitrogen in the soil prior to planting. And once it was introduced, nitrogen use over the whole country was dropped by 50%. So a lot of growers saved a lot of money. And the reason in Europe was groundwater quality. Again, I mentioned before nitrogen use efficiency. It's a really good checkup after you've harvested, and you just calculate how much you put in as nitrogen and how much you remove with the yield. So I showed you before a table with the removal rates, and you know how much you harvested in tons. So you can actually now the percentage, and I put an example down here, the percentage of nitrogen use efficiency. And I would think in a vegetable crop you really want to be above 60%. It would be nice to have 80%, but that might be hard in some conditions. But really, if you go to 50% less, it's probably not that good. So I just have some dot points, so you can go back to them later. What should you do? The first thing again, know the removal rates and adjust your rates. Make sure you know how much nitrogen is in the soil before you put heaps on. Make sure you consider organic matter or crop residues. For instance, after a cauliflower crop, the residues of nitrogen in that crop, or the leaves and stems, if you work that back in, that's worth about 170 kilograms of N. So there's quite a bit of stuff you put back in. If you then, of course, have the soil fallow, you will lose a lot of that. If you have a cover crop, you will keep that in the system. So it's really worthwhile thinking of nitrogen in vegetables a little bit differently. I mentioned before, no nitrate on wet soils. Fortunately, when the soil is really wet, you can actually not spread it, which is good. However, also watch the weather forecast. It's not much point putting out nitrate fertilizer when it's going to be wet shortly afterwards or very wet. Soil compaction is bad for everything, so that's the enemy number one. So irrigation monitoring and scheduling is important. It's really good to have an irrigation monitor below the root zone to actually see whether anything runs out the bottom. That's probably for me one of the best things about irrigation monitoring, because you often, you can only afford to have one monitor in the crop. So to actually see whether something is leaching is a really good thing. Certainly using the cover crops and compost and then learning how to best use nitrogen in that new system would be fantastic. Because, as I said before, if you have nitrogen cycling in a healthy system, the fertilizer bill will go down and the environmentalists in your community will be happy. So some key messages there. I think we went through them all just before, so I don't want to read it out again. But certainly crop health and nitrogen are closely linked. And you might have heard about that also in a previous webinar with Len, who talked about nutrition and diseases. So it's worthwhile looking back at that if you're interested. So this is really my first slide again, just to make sure that I haven't forgotten anything and for you to memorize all the things we went through. So the really important things is organic matter, nitrogen fixing, microbes. Try to put legumes maybe in as a rotation crop or as a cover crop. And the really important one, and that's where FertCare and EnviroVeg come in. Keep nitrogen in the wood zone, don't let it go into waterways, because it's a waste of money and it doesn't do any good to the environment. And that's really me in a very quick mini lecture on nitrogen, but I'm happy to answer questions.
That's great, thanks Doris. And worked through 18 slides very, very quickly, so we've got some time for questions now if you wanted to ask Doris or any of the presenters today that burning question that was ticking away in the back of the mind. Doris, just while we're waiting for those to come in, you mentioned quite a number of times through your talk moving away, I guess, from the fertiliser recipe and just rules of thumb, and that they're useful for a guide. If you are using that approach, what are some of the key things to start doing to move away from that approach?
Probably a really important thing you would have to do is to actually measure nitrogen in the soil around planting. The whole system, and I'm happy to put that out as part of our project. There's been a lot of work done in Europe to actually for all vegetable crops to say, how much nitrogen is needed, how much should be in the soil to start with, when you're planting, and then topping up to match the need of a growing crop, rather than putting a lot on, having these king hits of nitrogen and hoping for the best. Because of irrigation, and we have to manage crops anyway more intensively in vegetables, we don't have to put all the nitrogen up front, or a big hit.
We've got a question from Carl Young. Thanks, Carl. Should we have pre-planting soil end tests for each planting, as crop rotations may have different residual soil nitrogen?
I think it's really good. What I found is if you do that for a while, you can actually, because you know your land and you know what you're doing, and you watch the weather, you can have actually after a while good guesses. However, as you could see in that image, I might just try to get back. This image is quite typical, and you will find, if you think these are all paddocks on your farm, you will find differences. So the nitrogen test, you can use the deep soil nitrogen and just sample to the root zone, maybe 30 centimeters, or you can use the N-check nitrogen, which is done by Equita Analytical, which is the European system, where you can actually see how much nitrogen is there. There also is a method that you can use yourself. I can actually put out a fact sheet if people are interested, because I've already got it somewhere, so we could put it on the SoilWealth website, so people can actually check nitrogen themselves using color indicators, which are actually quite good.
Mm.
And I think it's worthwhile doing, especially for instance, if you grow lettuce, it's really sensitive to too much nitrogen, and you can get it wrong. And you can also do SEP testing to actually see how much the plant is actually taking up.
Also, Carl, could I just make a comment to Doris about that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Doris, although your map shows the pre-plant available nitrogen there, also another good test that I've used from time to time over the year is after a crop's been removed, like a potato crop or a carrot crop, also to do a test then. And that actually gives you a bit of an idea. This one gives you a bit of an idea of what you can expect. But also, the one for the post-crop also gives you a bit of an idea of how you're gone too, hasn't it?
Yes, that's fantastic. And actually, that reminds me, when I was in Germany ages ago, when I worked in the onion industry, the onion merchants in Germany asked for a post-harvest nitrogen test because they said if there's more than 50 kilograms per hectare in the root zone left in a paddock, the onions will not keep. So they would then, depending on what the market was like, don't take them, pay less for them, and make sure they don't store them. So they have insisted on that post-harvest test that you mentioned, David.
Mm. Thanks for that, David. A good point to raise. I'm just conscious of time, and we've approached or just gone over the hour, but I just wanted to get one last question in from Scott Wallace. Doris, do you think the nitrogen requirements by crop is well understood in Australian conditions, is Scott's question.
Yes, the reason I'm saying that is that if we know how much we harvest in tonnage, or how, I guess you can do two things. You can look at the total uptake and then look at how much you actually take away from the paddock. So this is the removal. And we do now, even if you do dry tissue testing, you actually do know the percentage of N in the crop, or you can, they're usually pretty good when you even look at books, but you can measure your own. So you know how much nitrogen you are going to remove with the crop on average, and you can look at that over several years. So you actually know how much is taken up and removed, and that will be the basis for the fertilizer budget. The other thing you then have to watch is how much is the soil contributing via maybe legume crops or via organic matter or compost or other inputs. So it is actually, rather than a recipe, it is a calculation.
That's good to know. There's a couple of more questions that have come through from Scott Wallace and Vince Davey, and I'm apologetic, but we'll just take those offline. We'll get Doris to follow up on email with you individually. Lastly, a big thank you to our presenters today, Andrew Shaw, David Anderson and Doris Blaesing. That's been excellent. A reminder too around the handouts. They can be downloaded from the control panel before we finish the session. And this recording plus the presentations will be uploaded onto the Soil Wealth website, and we'll send you out a link to that to watch it or use it as a podcast if you wanted to while you're driving between paddocks tomorrow lunchtime. So thanks again to the presenters and for you for attending, and we'll see you at the next Soil Wealth and ICP webinar. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.